For decades, Asperger syndrome was a name used to describe people who had major difficulties with social interaction and nonverbal communication, along with strong, focused interests and repetitive patterns of behavior. Many people who received the diagnosis were described as having average or above-average language and intellectual abilities, which made Asperger syndrome appear, in older diagnostic systems, as a so-called milder autism-related condition. But today, in major medical classification systems, Asperger syndrome is no longer a separate diagnosis. It has been merged into autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. That change was not simply a paperwork update. It reshaped how clinicians diagnose autism, how researchers study it, and how many people understand their own identities. To understand what the label used to mean, it helps to look at the pattern clinicians were trying to describe. People diagnosed with Asperger syndrome often struggled to read social cues that others process automatically, facial expressions, gestures, tone of voice, indirect hints, or the emotional meaning behind a conversation. They might speak at length about a favorite subject without realizing the listener wanted to respond or change topics. Some had difficulty forming friendships, not because they lacked interest in other people, but because the hidden rules of social exchange could be confusing, exhausting, or unclear. Repetitive routines, intense interests, and sensory sensitivities were also common parts of the picture. The condition was named in 1976 by the English psychiatrist Lorna Wing, who helped bring attention to a group of autistic people whose needs were often missed by older descriptions of autism. She named it after Austrian pediatrician Hans Asperger, who in 1944 had described children in his clinic who had difficulty with friendships, one-sided conversations, unusual interests, and physical clumsiness. Wing's work was influential because it pushed the field toward a broader view of autism. Instead of seeing autism only through the most obvious or disabling presentations, clinicians began to recognize that autistic traits could appear across a wider range of language abilities, intelligence levels, and everyday functioning. Asperger syndrome became an official standardized diagnosis in the 1990s. It was included in the World Health Organization's ICD-10, which came into effect in 1993, and then in the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-4 in 1994. This mattered because official categories influence who gets assessed, who receives services, and how schools and healthcare systems respond. For many children, teenagers, and adults, the Asperger diagnosis gave a name to lifelong experiences that had previously been misunderstood as rudeness, oddness, anxiety, stubbornness, or social failure. A diagnosis could bring relief, practical support, and connection with others who shared similar experiences. But the boundaries between Asperger syndrome and other autism diagnoses were never as clear as the manuals made them look. Clinicians often had trouble deciding where Asperger syndrome ended and where autism, high-functioning autism, or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified began. Two people with the same diagnosis could have very different support needs, while two people with different diagnoses could look very similar in daily life. Language development, intelligence tests, and early childhood history were used to separate categories, but those distinctions did not always predict what kind of help a person needed. Over time, the field moved toward the idea of one autism spectrum rather than several sharply divided conditions. In 2013, the DSM-5 removed Asperger syndrome as a separate diagnosis and folded it into autism spectrum disorder. The ICD-11 later made a similar shift, coming into effect in 2022. The word spectrum is important. It does not mean autism is a straight line from mild to severe. It means autistic people can have many different combinations of strengths, challenges, communication styles, sensory experiences, and support needs. The merger was intended to make diagnosis more consistent and to reflect a unified understanding of autism-related conditions. It was not meant to erase the people who had been diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, or to say their experiences were not real. Even after the diagnosis disappeared from current manuals, the term Asperger's continued to matter to many people. For some, it was the first word that made their life story make sense. It shaped how they found community, explained themselves to family, or asked for accommodations at school or work. Others preferred it because they felt it described their profile more specifically than the broad term autism. But the label also became controversial. A major reason was renewed public attention to Hans Asperger's actions during the Nazi era. The 2018 book Asperger's Children by historian Edith Schaeffer argued that Asperger was complicit in a system that murdered disabled children. After that, many people became less comfortable using the label. This history helps explain why language around autism can be emotionally charged. Diagnostic terms are not just technical labels, they can carry personal meaning, political meaning, and historical weight. Some people still identify with Asperger's because it reflects their diagnostic history and community identity. Others reject it because of its association with Hans Asperger or because they feel it creates an unhelpful divide between autistic people. Polling cited in the source article suggested that self-identification with the Asperger label dropped sharply between 2018 and 2022. That shift shows how medical language can change not only because science changes, but because society re-examines the people and values behind the words. What causes autism, including what used to be called Asperger syndrome, is still not fully understood. Research shows that autism is highly heritable, meaning genetics play a major role. But there is no single autism gene, and the underlying genetic picture is complex. Environmental factors are also believed to contribute, though this does not mean simple or discredited explanations. Brain imaging has found differences in some studies, but it has not revealed one common brain condition that explains autism in all people. The best current understanding is that autism develops through many interacting biological pathways, which helps explain why autistic people can differ so widely from one another. Because autism is not a disease that can simply be removed or cured, modern support is not supposed to focus on making an autistic person stop being autistic. The UK's National Health Service has stated that treatment of autism itself should not be the goal. The Royal College of Psychiatrists similarly emphasizes education, training, social support, and care that help a person function in everyday life. That distinction matters. Some autistic people may need help with communication, anxiety, sensory overload, daily routines, school, employment, or relationships. Support should reduce distress and improve quality of life, not force someone to hide harmless autistic traits just to appear more typical. Interventions can include social skills training, cognitive behavioral therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, parent training, educational accommodations, and support for independent living. Medications may be used for associated problems such as anxiety, depression, mood difficulties, sleep issues, or attention problems, but there is no medication that treats autism itself. The evidence for specific autism interventions is mixed and often limited, so support works best when it is individualized. A person who struggles with workplace communication may need different help from someone overwhelmed by sensory environments, and both may need something different from a child learning to navigate school routines. In adulthood, autistic characteristics may become less obvious, but that does not mean they disappear. Many adults learn scripts, coping strategies, or ways to manage environments that once overwhelmed them. Some become highly skilled in areas connected to their interests. But social and communication difficulties often persist, and masking those difficulties can be exhausting. Diagnosis also remains uneven. Autism spectrum disorder is diagnosed more often in males than females, and females are often diagnosed later, sometimes because their traits are missed, camouflaged, or interpreted through other labels. The old Asperger category may be gone, but the questions it raised remain central: how to recognize autistic people accurately, respect their identities, and provide support that actually fits their lives. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.